In the preparatory discussion, Section 9, we already profiled characteristics of being which are to provide us with a steady light for our further investigation, but which at the same time receive their structural concretion in this investigation. Dasein is a being which is related understandingly in its being toward that being sane. In saying this, we are indicating the formal concept of existence. Dasein exists. Furthermore, Dasein is the being which I myself always am. Meiness Gemenicate belongs to existing Dasein as the condition of the possibility of authenticity and inauthenticity. Dasein exists always in one of these modes, or else in the modal indifference to them. These determinations of the being Seinsbestimmungen of Dasein, however, must now be seen and understood a priori on the basis of that constitution of being which we call being in the world. The correct point of departure of the analytic of Dasein consists in the interpretation of this constitution. The compound expression, being in the world, indicates, in the very way we have coined it, that it stands for a unified phenomenon. This primary datum must be seen as a whole. But while being in the world cannot be broken up into components that may be pieced together, this does not prevent it from having a multiplicity of constitutive structural factors. The phenomenal fact indicated by this expression actually gives us a threefold perspective. If we pursue it while keeping the whole phenomenon in mind from the outset, we have the following. 1. In the world, in relation to this factor, we have the task of questioning the ontological structure of world, and of defining the idea of worldliness as such. Cf. Chapter 3 of this division. 2. The being Cn which always has being in the world as the way it is. In it, we are looking for what we are questioning when we ask about the who. In our phenomenological demonstration, we should be able to determine who is in the mode of the average everydayness of Dasein. Cf. Chapter 4 of this division. 3. Being in as such, the ontological constitution of inness itself is to be analyzed. Cf. Chapter 5 of this division. Any analysis of one of these constitutive factors involves the analysis of the others, that is, each time seeing the whole phenomenon. It is true that being in the world is an a priori necessary constitution of Dasein, but it is not at all sufficient to fully determine Dasein's being. Before we thematically analyze the three phenomena indicated individually, we shall attempt to orient ourselves toward a characteristic of the third of these constitutive factors. What does being in mean? We supplement the expression being in right away with the phrase in the world, and are inclined to understand this being in insane as being in, sane in. With this term, the kind of being of a being is named which is in something else, as water is in the glass, the dress is in the closet. By this in, we mean the relation of being that two beings extended in space have to each other with regard to their location in that space. Water and glass, dress and closet are both in space at a location in the same way. This relation of being can be expanded. That is, the bench in the lecture hall in the university in the city, and so on until the bench in the cosmos, Weltraum. These beings whose being in one another can be determined in this way all have the same kind of being, that of being present as things occurring within the world. Being present in something objectively present, and the being present together with something having the same kind of being in the sense of a determinate relation to place, are ontological characteristics which we call categorial. They belong to beings whose kind of being is unlike Dasein. In contrast, being in designates a constitution of being of Dasein and is an existential. Thus, we cannot understand by this the objective presence of a corporeal thing corporating, the human body mentioned in a being objectively present. Nor does the term being in designate a spatial, in one another of two things objectively present, any more than the word in primordially means a spatial relation of this kind. It stems from innan, to live, habitare, to dwell, and means I am used to, familiar with, I take care of something. It has the meaning of kolo, in the sense of habito and diligo. We characterize this being to whom being in belongs in this meaning, as the being which I myself always am. The expression bin, I connected with be. Ik bin, I am, means I dwell, I stay near, the world is something familiar in such and such a way. Beings as the infinitive of I am, that is, understood as an existential, means to dwell near. To be familiar with, being in is thus the formal existential expression of the being of Dasein which has the essential constitution of being in the world. Being together with, sane be the world, in the sense of being absorbed in the world which must be further interpreted, is an existential which is grounded in being it. Because we are concerned in these analyses with seeing a primordial structure of being of Dasein, in accordance with whose phenomenal content the concepts of being must be articulated, and because this structure is fundamentally incomprehensible in terms of the traditional ontological categories, this being together with must also be examined more closely. We shall again choose the method of contrasting it with something essentially ontologically different, that is, a categorical relation of being which we express linguistically with the same meaning. Fundamental ontological distinctions are easily obliterated, and if they are to be envisaged phenomenally in this way, this must be done explicitly, even at the risk of discussing something obvious. The status of the ontological analytic, however, shows that we do not at all have these obvious matters adequately in our grasp. Still less have we interpreted them in the meaning of their being, and we are even farther from possessing the proper structural concepts in a secure form. As an existential, being together with the world never means anything like the being objectively present together of things that occur. There is no such thing as the being next to each other of a being called Dasein with another being called world. It is true that at times we are accustomed to express linguistically the being together of two objectively present things in such a manner. The table stands next to the door. The chair touches the wall. Strictly speaking, we can never talk about touching, not because in the last analysis we can always find a space between the chair and the wall by examining it more closely, but because in principle the chair can never touch the wall, even if the space between them amounted to nothing. A presupposition for this would be that the wall could be encountered by the chair. A being sciens can only touch a being present within the world, if that first being fundamentally has the kind of being in, only if with its Dasein something like world is already discovered in terms of which beings can reveal themselves through touch, and thus become accessible in their being present. Two beings which are present within the world and are, moreover, worldless in themselves, can never touch each other, neither can they be together with one another. The supplement which are moreover worldless must not be left out, because those beings which are not worldless, for example Dasein itself, are present in the world too. More precisely, they can be understood within certain limits and with a certain justification as something merely present. To do this, one must completely disregard, or just not see the existential constitution of being it. But with this possible understanding of Dasein as something objectively present, and only objectively present, we may not attribute to Dasein its own kind of objective presence. This objective presence does not become accessible by disregarding the specific structures of Dasein, but only in a previous understanding of them. Dasein understands its almost being in the sense of a certain factual objective presence. 2. And yet the factuality of the fact of one's own Dasein is ontologically fundamentally different from the factual occurrence of a kind of stone. The factuality of the fact of Dasein, as the way in which every Dasein actually is, we call its facticity. The complicated structure of this determination of being is itself comprehensible as a problem only in the light of the existential fundamental constitutions of Dasein which we have already worked out. The concept of facticity implies that an inner-worldly being has being in the world in such a way that it can understand itself as bound up in its destiny, with the being of those beings which it encounters within its own world. Initially, it is only a matter of seeing the ontological distinction between being in as an existential and the category of the insideness that things objectively present can have with regard to one another. If we define being in this way, we are not denying to Dasein every kind of spatiality. On the contrary, Dasein itself has its own being in space, which in its turn is possible only on the basis of being in the world in general. Thus, being in cannot be clarified ontologically by an ontic characteristic, by saying, for example, being in a world is a spiritual quality, and the spatiality of human being is an attribute of its bodiliness which is always at the same time based on corporeality. Here again we are faced with a being objectively present together of a spiritual thing, thus constituted with a corporeal thing, and the being of the beings thus compounded is more obscure than ever. The understanding of being in the world as an essential structure of Dasein first makes possible the insight into its existential spatiality. This insight will keep us from failing to see this structure or from previously canceling it out, a procedure motivated not ontologically, but metaphysically, in the naive opinion that human being is initially a spiritual thing which is then subsequently placed in a space. With its facticity, the being in the world of Dasein has already dispersed itself in definite ways of being in, perhaps even split itself up. The multiplicity of these kinds of being in can be indicated by the following examples: to have to do with something, to produce, order and take care of something, to use something, to give something up and let it get lost, to undertake, to accomplish, to find out, to ask about, to observe, to speak about, to determine. These ways of being in have the kind of being of taking care of besorgen which we shall characterize in greater detail. The deficient modes of omitting, neglecting, renouncing, resting, are also ways of taking care of something, in which the possibilities of taking care are kept to a bare minimum. The term taking care has initially its pre-scientific meaning and can imply carrying something out, settling something, to straighten it out. The expression could also mean to take care of something in the sense of getting it for oneself. Furthermore, we use the expression also in a characteristic turn of phrase: I will see to it, or take care that the enterprise fail. Here, to take care amounts to apprehensiveness. In contrast to these pre-scientific ontic meanings, the expression taking care is used in this inquiry as an ontological term, an existential, to designate the being of a possible being in the world. We do not choose this term because Dasein is initially economical and practical to a large extent, but because Dasein itself is to be made visible as care source. Again, this expression is to be understood as an ontological structure concept, cf. Chapter 6 of this division. The expression has nothing to do with distress, melancholy, or the cares of life, which can be found ontically in every Dasein. These, like their opposites, carefreeness and gaiety, are ontically possible only because Dasein, ontologically understood, is care. Because being in the world belongs essentially to Dasein, its being toward the world is essentially taking according to what we have said. Being in is not a property, which Dasein sometimes has and sometimes does not have, without which it could be just as well as it could with it. It is not the case that human being is, and then on top of that has a relation of being to the world, which it sometimes takes upon itself. Dasein is never, initially, a sort of a being which is free from being in, but which at times is in the mood to take up a relation to the world. This taking up of relations to the world is possible only because, as being in the world, Dasein is as it is. This constitution of being is not first derived from the fact that besides the being which has the character of Dasein, there are other beings which are objectively present and meet up with it. These other beings can only meet up with Dasein because they are able to show themselves of their own accord within a world. The saying used so often today, human beings have their environment Umwelt, does not say anything ontologically as long as this having is undetermined. In its very possibility, this having has its foundation in the existential constitution of being it. As a being essentially existing in this way, Dasein can explicitly discover beings which it encounters in the environment, can know about them, can avail itself of them, can have the world. The ontically trivial talk about having an environment is ontologically a problem. To solve it requires nothing less than defining the being of Dasein beforehand in an ontologically adequate way. If in biology use has been made of this constitution of being, especially since K. E. von Baer, one must not conclude that its philosophical use implies biologism. For as a positive science, biology too can never find and determine this structure, it must presuppose it and continually make use of it. This structure itself, however, can be explicated philosophically as the priori condition for the thematic objects of biology only if it is understood beforehand as a structure of Dasein. Only in terms of an orientation toward the ontological structure thus understood can life, as a constitution of being, be defined a priori in a privative way. Ontically as well as ontologically, being in the world has priority as taking care. This structure gets its fundamental interpretation in the analytic of Dasein. But does not this determination of the constitution of being discussed up to now move exclusively in negative statement? Though this being in is supposedly so fundamental, we always keep hearing what it is not. Indeed, but the prevalence of negative characteristics is no accident. Rather, it makes known what is peculiar to this phenomenon, and is thus positive in a genuine sense appropriate to the phenomenon itself. The phenomenological demonstration of being in the world has the character of rejecting dissimulations Verstillungen and obfuscations Vertikungen, because this phenomenon is always already seen in every Dasein in a certain way. And that is true because it makes up a fundamental constitution of Dasein, in that it is always already disclosed, along with its being, for the understanding of being in Dasein. But the phenomenon has mostly been basically misinterpreted, or interpreted in an ontologically inadequate way. Plus or minus, however, this seeing in a certain way, and yet mostly misinterpreting, is itself based on nothing other than this constitution of being of Dasein itself. In accordance with that constitution, Dasein understands itself ontologically, and that means also its being in the world initially in terms of those beings, and their being which it itself is not, but which it encounters within its world. Both in Dasein and for it, this constitution of being is always already somehow familiar. If it is now to be recognized, the explicit cognition that this task implies takes itself, as a knowing of the world, as the exemplary relation of the soul to the world. The cognition of world, vo Eve, or addressing oneself to the world, and discussing it, zoyag, thus functions as the primary mode of being in the world, even though being in the world is not understood as such. But because this structure of being remains ontologically inaccessible, yet is ontically experienced as the relation between one being, world, and another, soul, and because being is initially understood by taking beings as inner-worldy beings for one's ontological support, one tries to conceive the relation between world and soul as grounded in these beings, and in the sense of their being, that is, as objective present. Although it is experienced and known pre-phenomenologically, being in the world is invisible if one interprets it in a way that is ontologically inadequate. One is just barely acquainted with this constitution of Dasein only in the form given by an inadequate interpretation, and indeed as something obvious. In this way it then becomes the evident point of departure for the problems of epistemology, or a metaphysics of knowledge. For what is more obvious than the fact that a subject is related to an object, and the other way around? This subject-object relation must be presupposed. But that is a presupposition which, although it is inviolate in its own facticity, is truly fatal, perhaps for that very reason, if its ontological necessity and especially its ontological meaning are left in obscurity. Thus the phenomenon of being in has for the most part been represented exclusively by a single exemplar knowing the world. This has not only been the case in epistemology, for even practical behavior has been understood as behavior which is not theoretical and atheoretical. Because knowing has been given this priority, our understanding of its almost kind of being is led astray, and thus being in the world must be delineated more precisely with reference to knowing the world, and must itself be made visible as an existential modality of being in.